Okay. Hazel, thanks very much for doing the interview. They're not going to be interested in what I have to say, so don't worry about it. I will interject at times, but I'll take that out of the interview itself. It's really your memories from that period, 1912 to 1923. We can stop and start it as we go on, so don't worry too much about that sort of thing. You're going to talk about a number of people in your family. We'll come on to your grandfather to start with in a second. Tell us a bit about your family, where you've lived, and this area this beautiful part of Omagh that we're in.
Well, my name is Hazel McGuigan. I was Hazel McCune. I am the third generation of the same family in the same house. It was my parents' house, my mother's house, and then it was her mother's house. So it has gone down into generations of women. And in Campsie Crescent, where I live, the only thing we had was community spirit, because nobody, as a child growing up in Campsie, nobody had anything. And my father had been in the Second World War, and we have a beautiful park in Campsie, which has a lot to do with the story as well, because the time that the king abdicated to marry Wallace Simpson, the new King George allotted 147 play parks, and ours is one of those play parks. And I think we might be the only play park that is still going strong. And it used to be locked up every night at 8 o'clock and not open to the morning. On Sundays it didn't open at all. And over the years, then you couldn't lock it at night because people could get hurt climbing over the railings. And we have lobbied very hard and got the play park locked up again, and we look after it ourselves. Lock it up at night and open it in the morning. That I think is one of the oldest, and I think really the only one now of King George's fields that is left.
I didn't know that happened. Where is the play park?
Just down from me, just straight on down. And we look after it. And I was, years ago, you would have talked to your own councillor, and we felt the park was being downgraded, so we asked, could we get some money to do it up? And I was speaking to a councillor, and he said, Mrs. McGuigan dear, do you not realise you're living in a ghetto? Well, I said, I never thought I was, but we'll see. And I went to another councillor, and he said, I will agree to nothing in the council chamber until Campsie gets some money. So we got £85,000. And we have a beautiful football, basketball area. We got new swings and all that. And we did a few art projects to do with Campsie, because it was allotments belonging to the houses. And then King George's Fields came along, and they gave over, the residents gave over their allotments to make it into a safe place for kids to play.
Right.
And it is in the council minutes, forever, amen. It cannot be changed at all. People have tried to change it. They have tried to take the wall around the park down to make more parking areas, and no, they can't do that.
Good.
And with antisocial behaviour, now a few of us go around every night, lock up the park and listen to all our older people if they have any complaints. And we had a 91-year-old man who lived on his own and thought he was living independently because his panic button went to the house next door, and if it fell or anything, we were in right away. And the time of the big freeze, there were 17 houses that their pipes froze, and we had a plumber lives in the area, so, and the women went in and cleaned and mopped everything up, and we have carried that out all the time. We look after everybody, so why would the Syrians not be invited in here if they need to do whatever they have to do? Because in the first lockdown we had quite a few musicians in Kelsey, so we decided we'd have a musical recital.
Oh, very good, good for you. And is that all happening here in the hub? Because there's a lovely building.
No. It happens in the park.
In the park outside? Okay, very good.
Because the park was locked up, we weren't allowed to have the park open. So we went around the houses and said, we're having a musical recital, please come out and stand and wave at us. At something, and then we had a fiddle player, and we had a clarinet player, and we had a flute player. And after we finished, and everybody did come out, and we were waving at everybody, and quite a few people around, we could say the music recital was absolutely amazing. It was great for...
Fantastic. I didn't realise that was during COVID. This is recent. That's why I was outside, of course. That's a great idea.
And then we had decided we'd have an afternoon tea party a few weeks later because the weather was glorious. Yeah. So we bought cake, and if we went to your house and you lived on your own, we'd give you a slice of cake, and you had to make your own tea, but you'd come out and join us all.
Yeah.
And that was great morale booster too.
Good.
And then we got council, because I'm a community rep. They give us money, so we bought groceries and gave them round to everybody. But that's what I say, Kelsey is a very, very community spirit area, and I think there isn't so many now anymore because everybody's put in these housing estates and there's too many.
Well, do you know, it's part of the reason why we wanted to do these interviews, because that community spirit, we want to keep some of the memories of that community spirit alive from a long time ago. So we're going to talk about some of the people who lived there 100 or so years ago, and we're going to start off with your grandfather.
Yes.
So tell us who your grandfather was.
My grandfather was William McGuigan, and he lived in Belfast, the Dunamary area, and he signed up in the First World War and became a sergeant, whatever time he had signed up, and was fond of a drink. I think it wasn't talked about that much at home, because my mother and father, if you started talking too much about that, they would look at one another and change the subject. I would have assumed it was because they didn't want to talk about the war. It actually turned out to be they didn't want to talk about my grandfather because he was absent without leave, stayed too long in a pub, and was demoted to a corporal and sent to France. And there he was blown up in the very early stages of the Battle of the Somme. And my father at that stage was 7, and he came home from school to be told by his mother, your father will not be coming home, he's been killed at the Battle of the Somme. And I would think, as he grew up, my father, that he realised that if anything happened again, he would be looking to get back into the army to get the straight back for his father. And the neighbours, he was also killed at the Battle of the Somme. So, and they were a Catholic family that lived next door to me granny. And after the First World War ended, Spanish flu arrived, and the mother died of Spanish flu. And this child, Anthony, was going to be put in an orphanage, and my granny said, no, he's coming to live with us. And I think that's where my father realised that it is quite a given thing to help anybody out. And my granny took Anthony every Sunday to Mass, and then went to her own church after that. And Anthony lived with my granny until he was man big and went to Canada. And I think that's where my father got his early ideas about we can all live together, because he never could understand what this fighting was all about amongst us all. And he would have said many times, I'm an Irishman, I joined an Irish regiment, Hazel, he would say to me, if you ever have an argument, if you have to leave the table, I don't know how many times, go away and come back, but don't lose your temper, because you've lost the argument. And he says, anything is better than war. That is a terrible thing. But they were deeply embarrassed by my grandfather losing the stripe because he was absent without leave.
Well, I want to ask you whether your father was able to get the stripe back, and we'll talk about that in a few minutes' time. But let's go back to your grandfather. So he would have joined up at the start of the First World War, if he, because you're saying he's killed at the Somme.
Yeah.
Tell us what rank he achieved and what he was demoted to, and just remind us again, why was he demoted before he went off to France?
He was demoted because he was absent without leave. He stayed too long in a public house and was very drunk and must have fell asleep. But when he arrived at his camp the next morning, he was demoted to a corporal. He lost his sergeant's stripe and was demoted to a corporal, and then went across to the Somme and was one of many thousands killed. And as I say, my granny must have told my father the story, and as I say, it must have been a complete embarrassment to them, because nobody mentions it over the years at all. My mother and father would have been talking about when his father was killed at the age when my father was 7, and then all of a sudden they'd look at one another and then we changed the subject, and I would have assumed it was because you don't be talking about the war and stuff like that, when actually it was because you would maybe be asking any questions, and then they would have to admit my father went to his grave not telling me that story. I only found it out from relatives of his sister.
That he'd lost his stripe because he'd been drinking the night before. And again, of course, I mean, it's an obvious thing to say that losing a stripe because you've been drinking is one thing, but actually it's nowhere near as important as the sacrifice, which was he gave his life fighting in the army.
Yes, and he took with losing his stripe and still went across, because it must have been, my father would have been exactly the same. You know, these things you must do. When I would have said to my father, who was in the Second World War, did you have to shoot anybody? Me? I was lying on the beaches at Tunis, eating grapes. I never, because old soldiers don't tell stories out of school, they don't. And I'd say spent the whole of the Second World War lying on the beaches at Tunis, eating grapes. And yet he had shrapnel on his face here, and it lost a finger, and half of his finger, but he just spent his whole time on beaches, Tunis.
You don't get those injuries through the grapes. It
No,
must have been
obviously
something else.
not. But I think from a cousin of mine, he actually was captured and was hand-to-hand fighting at that time. but we never discussed things like that at all. And as I say, it was a total embarrassment that my grandfather was demoted because he was absent without leave.
Your grandfather was blown up, you said, at the sun.
Mm-hmm.
And I think you said that your grandmother had to call your father in when he was 7 to tell him. That must have been a very hard thing for your grandmother to do, but also incredibly hard for your father to hear that.
It was, but as he said himself, there were so many, they were all streets of people that joined up and went away and never came back, just never came back. And, it was only in this last, say, 10 years that Glenbar started that I found out that I could go and look for his name on the Manning Gate.
And did you?
I did, and I found it. And I put a poppy beside his name, and I was able to bring earth back from the song and put it on my father's grave. And that would have been the first time. And as the gentleman in charge of us said, you'll be the first person to say a prayer at the Manning Gate for your granda after 90 years. And I thought, isn't that amazing? And there was a man with us called Ernie Coburn, who came from Gallas Hill, which is another old history place in Omagh. And he was called Ernie Thomas Coburn for an uncle of his who was killed at the Battle of the Somme as well. He was 19 when he was killed. And we actually found Thomas Coburn's grave. And Ernie was like a grandfather at that stage. And I said to him, apparently you can write some kind of word in a book they have here. And he said, you may write it for me, Hazel, because you can't speak. I can do nothing, only cry here. And he wouldn't have known his uncle at all. And yet that is how you feel when you get over there. A soldier known only to God, and so many of those headstones, a soldier known only to God.
And they were very young men, almost all of them.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
And
we were down the trenches and everything. We did the whole tour, and we're in the trenches and saw where they slept, and the mud, and they coped with so much stuff. I think all kids should be made, school children should go over and see that. It might change their minds about, to see so many. We found John Condon's grave, Willie McBride's grave. And they told the story about John Condon, that he was 14 and was killed. His mother didn't even know where he had gone. He went and joined up to get a pair of boots. And people leave money on his headstone. And then we were at Willie McBride's grave, and they played the music, Willie McBride. It was a very emotional trip for all of us.
And you said that locally there was just down, was it your next door neighbour had a son that went as well? They were from a Catholic background?
Yes.
So it was people from different backgrounds.
But they all lived in an area where they all mixed together, and their neighbour might have been a different religion, but and he didn't come back either. And then after the war, this little child's mother died of the Spanish flu, which was rife at that time, and they were coming to take the people in suits were coming to take him to an orphanage, and my granny said, no, he'll come and live with us. He's not going into an orphanage. His mother would want him to stay with us. And my granny took him every Sunday to the chapel, and then she went to her own church after that, and Anthony lived with them and went to his chapel every Sunday, And my granny went to her church after that until he grew up and went to Canada. And then we've all lost touch now.
Well, I'll come back to that as well, but it occurs to me, obviously Spanish flu, we're talking 1919, 1920, bit of a worldwide pandemic like we have in 2021.
Yes.
And it's a real hardship then for somebody like your grandmother who has lost her husband, so there's no main breadwinner,
No.
I assume, in the family, but she's taken other children in from a different religion.
Yes.
And this is at a time when there's a lot of conflict in Ireland. There's
Absolutely.
between
When a lot of people would have come back and Home Rule had come in at that stage, and people who did join up and were lucky enough to come back were treated like traitors at that time. So I would think it wasn't easy at all, but she did it anyway, and I really think at times that's where my father learned about people and what is the right thing to do and what isn't the right thing to be doing. And I was fortunate enough a few years ago, there was money, the council were giving out money to, if you could think of something to do with the centenary. So we decided we would like to go on a trip to hear about the markets. Markovich, the Countess Markovich.
Yeah.
So, and we wanted to go to Newton Ards to the song, and we got in contact with the house, Lissadell House in Sligo, and said that we were a women's group and we were a mixed group and we wanted to go and hear the story of the Countess and the Gore booths and all them. And we got a nice little email back to say the tour was only an hour and they couldn't possibly tell us enough. And I thought, well, lovely, great, but we got the £1,000 from the council to do this. And then I got a letter from a man called Leo Layden, whose granny worked in Lissadell House, and he was a historian, and he'd be delighted to meet us and take us round Lissadell House and stay with us the whole day, and we could have lunch and all of it. So we found out about the Countess. And you're allowed to take photographs on the ground floor, but once you go up to the galleries, you're not allowed to take photographs. And some of her letters, when she was interned in prison, said, "Do not be worrying about me. I have the loveliest scene from my prison window." So that has, now we were a very mixed group, and I was quite worried about maybe there has been stories handed down to people which aren't exactly right, and but we all enjoyed the day so much. It was a brilliant day, and Leo Layden had no notes. He just had it all, took us round and explained about the Gore booths and about Countess Markovich, and we had a brilliant day and nobody wanted to go home. And then we went to Newton Ards on a different Saturday. It was a lovely day too, and there was a 27-year-old young fella who had no notes either and took us round the whole thing. And I said to him, makes an awful difference not to be reading it from a book. And he said, I have told this story so often. And I think, you know, we were a crowd of middle-aged women, well, some older than middle-aged, and we had an excellent time hearing all about Home Rule and all these terrible things that had happened to people that had joined up to go and fight for people that were being bullied into submission, and they give up their lives, like. And then when we came to the Second World War, my father joined up because he was determined to get this straight back for his father, and then we could all live and glory after it.
Well, your father suffered shrapnel wounds, and you've said, and a number of other things. Well, he claims he was eating grapes on a beach in Tunis. So what did motivate him to join up? Was it just getting the stripe back? And did he eventually get the stripe back?
He was demobbed as a sergeant, Charles McGuigan, in the Irish Guards. And the Irish Guards motto, I think, is "we cannot be separated." Something like that.
Okay.
And he always said that his early years living in Belfast was what made him join the Irish Guard. We cannot be separated.
Okay.
And I just thought he was a wonderful man, because he told you very little about his war escapades, but he took great pride in being a sergeant, being demobbed as a sergeant. But I never realised why until I heard the story from a cousin of mine. And he never told us that at any time. But I could still see my mother and father looking at one another. Just a great day out there, going out and playing.
What I also find, there's two or three things I find really fascinating in a lot of that. So you have a 7-year-old boy being told at home by his mother, your dad isn't coming home, he's been killed at the site.
And they can't even, they have no grave to go to, nothing.
No grave to go to, presumably an economic hardship for the family.
Oh, absolutely.
Even though there'd been a bit of income, but it wouldn't have been as much as if the father had still been there. And yet here's this young lad growing up and 20 years later joining the army himself.
Mm-hmm.
That's obviously something about service or about a connection to the father that he would still go and do, because it's not compulsory here in Northern Ireland in the Second World War or in the First World War in Ireland as a whole. It was a voluntary thing people did.
It is and was, but he went anyway because he was determined to get the straight back. And I would have said to him, you didn't have to join up. Why did you? I felt it was the right thing to do, but that was it. Never did he mention anything else. I thought it was the right thing to do, and I still have his demob papers in the house. And he actually, my father was given by the First Omagh Church a Bible for his contribution to the Second World War, and his name is actually in First Omagh. I was invited to an unveiling of all the names, and so my father's name is there as well. And as I say, I got the opportunity to go to Belgium and saw my grandest name on the Manning Gate, and thought it would be the right thing to do to bring the heirs back from the Somme, all those places, and had bits of dirt from here and bits of dirt from there, and had it all in a wee box and brought it back and put it in my father's grave. And I thought, I've reunited them at long last.
But the other thing is, you have a situation where in 1919 with the Spanish flu, in a fairly mixed community, two men who had been killed in the First World War, and the son of one then loses his mother and is adopted by your family. And I think your family's from a Protestant background, that family's from a Catholic background. At the same time as you talked about Countess Markievicz, Ireland is in just a huge upheaval, largely because of conflict that is political and about identity, but it's also people divided by faith, and yet here's your family.
I know.
And your father really has another brother then, in a sense, an adopted brother from a Catholic background.
Yes.
Would that have been a big discussion with him or within the family?
No. My father used to say, everybody's welcome in this house, as long as they're treated with dignity and respect. All are welcome here. And he was very interested in people, my father. And he was very popular down in the British Legion there. And as I say, when I got married, my husband was a different religion to me. And I said, I don't expect you to come to my wedding, but I intend to marry in a Catholic church. I will not change my religion. But because my husband was a builder, he would have lost any credence with anybody. And he was good at his work, what he did. And if he'd have married me in a Protestant church, he would never have worked again in this town. So we went to his priest, and he threw us out altogether. Didn't want anything to do with the whole thing. And my father said to me, Hazel, do you think I won't be standing beside you? You must be joking. Have you learned nothing about me in this whole time we've spent together? And then the next thing he says, don't leave me by myself. Come back and live here for a while. And we never left. We stayed here then. But he was a forward-thinking man, and he never lost his grassroots. And he made sure that all of us in Kempsey kept to grassroots level. Nobody's better than anybody else, and if you have anything, share it.
Do you think he was influenced by, he would have been 10 or so then when Anthony was living at his house. Would that have influenced him a lot, do you think?
I think it would. I definitely think it would, because he would have seen Anthony as a family member, and maybe all the stuff that was going on, he wouldn't have liked any of that. I mean, he played the lambeg drums and was able to beat it out at the side of the chair where he was sitting on for the rest of his life, and was in the Orange Order, and we would have went to Belfast to see him parading, and he enjoyed all those kind of things. And then he came in one day and said, time to put these things away. No more for me. There is a very sinister element creeping in to all these things now, and I want nothing to do with it. And never, ever put on his sash again or anything like that. So he would have felt it extremely because of Anthony, I would assume. He would have thought of, he'd been influenced by his mother, of course, and she would have felt sorry for Anthony, and of course she knew him, so she was going to keep him. And I think he would have thought it awful the way people talked about one another and were quite vicious at times. And then coming up to the B-men and all that, black and tans, all that kind of thing. He had no time for any of that at all, and I never knew why, but now I've steeped in all Irish courses, history courses, and realised it must have been absolutely woeful for them all at that time, especially for his mother, having taken this child in.
But it also shows, a bit like now, where within communities that there still is mixing and friendships that go on, and I suppose the same was true 100 years ago, that your grandmother was the friend of Anthony's
Absolutely,
wife.
next door neighbour,
Yeah.
and naturally. And I went in a women's group to, and I met a woman called Lily McGuigan, whose husband was interned in the Troubles. And she said, she was in charge of us all. And she said she had 6 kids and he was interned. Then he decided he wouldn't eat British food. So she had to come every day to the prison with his dinner. And then when he got out of internment, half the women on the street were throwing themselves at him. And she would have had to take a back seat again. And then he was interned again, and that's when she wised up, she said, and went and got herself an education, and has done her bit to try and bring the two communities together, but had to go and ask, this is only a few years ago, had to go and ask the paramilitaries, could she do this? And she said it was the greatest learning curve for me when I realised that he was going to be interned and come back after me having to cope and look after kids, 6 kids, while he sat up and refused British food as well. And all those things I have got steeped in now, because I think it must have been because of my father, and the cycle goes on and on.
What happened to Anthony? Do you know?
Oh, yeah, well...
He's probably not with us now, I would assume.
I wouldn't. Wilfred might know. I will have to get on to Wilfred Crawford, who is my cousin. And last time I ever saw Wilfred, we were only about 7 or 8, and he was about 15, and he was a real teddy boy. I can remember in a leather jacket and jeans and all, and he only got in touch with me a few years ago. Now, he did come down, him and his brother came down to my father's funeral 30 odd years ago, and then I've lost touch with him, but he rang a few years ago and said, is that Hazel? And I said, it is. And he said, this is your cousin Wilfred. And I says, how did you get this number, like? And he said, I kept it, but I didn't know whether you'd ever moved or not. And I says, no, I never did move, and I'll never move now. And so every so often he would ring.
Who is he? He's your cousin, so is that your father?
His father's sisters,
right.
My father's sisters.
So your aunt's son, right.
Aunt Annie.
Right.
And she lived in Bootle Street in Belfast.
Yeah.
But then, when I think about it, there are so many different churches in Belfast. You know, there's like pastors, and so they were some kind of a, you know, gospel haulers or whatever they were. I don't know what they were, but anyway, they were genuinely decent people when they would take a child in.
Absolutely. And from a different background, like Anthony was, Anthony, you said, emigrated to Canada. Do you know when, what that was, why it was, and does he have family, or did he have family?
Well, I think he did have a family, but I know that the last time I was speaking to Wilfred the other night, he said about Stephen and Colin. I said, you are joking. No, he says, I'm not. Why are you saying that? And I said, because my sons are called Stephen and Colin. And he says, isn't that the most peculiar thing? And I said, but people will tell you the cycle repeats and repeats. And I have to say, I am delighted the way that my father was a great influencer on us all, because he welcomed my in-laws into our house, and You know, at times we would have heard of somebody being involved in IRA and that. My father never talked about them things at all because he said, I don't want to even get involved in any of that.
And we don't want to talk about that sort of thing
No.
at the minute, just in terms of recency.
But no, he wasn't involved, and he was totally open to us all living together in harmony.
Omagh would have been quite a rural community back in those days. Was there anything your father or mother talked about, or grandparents, about living here at that time in the 1910s and 20s in the rural setting, or crossing the border? Or
Oh, well, of course there was the sugar trains and all that to go to Bundoran, and people were coming back with sugar in coats, pockets and everything else.
And they're called the sugar trains because you were
bringing sugar back and butter.
Which wasn't allowed.
And all that kind of thing. And I think my mother was of a nervous disposition because she would not, she didn't want to talk about home rule or any of them things at all at that particular time. I suppose my father thought plenty and said very little because he just lived his life helping people where he could, and if he couldn't, well, he wouldn't harm them anyway. And he was very interested in meeting all our friends, you know, and as I say, he lived with me for 16 years after I got married, and I don't think he would have been alive if we hadn't stayed with him, because when my mother died, he took it very badly indeed. And then I was getting married shortly after she died, and he said, "You won't be leaving me by myself?" And she could come and live here, you know. And I said to my husband then, to be, I said, if you don't come and live with us, well, you can't get married at all, because I can't leave him by himself. And I think really when our Stevie arrived, my father said to me, as soon as we brought him in, give that child to me. And I did that. And I think that's what kept him going. Mm-hmm. But, and he used to go down to the Legion there, and he would have a couple of drinks down there and that, but he still wouldn't tell you anything, only that you have to be kind to people, look after everybody.
I want to ask you again though about the sugar trains, because I think that's really interesting. So where did they go to and from? And
well, we had a railway station in Omagh, and that would have went to Bundoran, and people would have had maybe 4 or 5 cooks in them to bring sugar and butter and all that kind of thing. And people would have cycled over the border if they were anywhere near hand at all, and brought stuff back as well. I wouldn't be that familiar with the sugar trains and that, but there's quite a few plays and that have been done about the sugar trains, and nearly anybody could tell you a wee bit about it. And I think the biggest change that ever came to me was the loss of the trains. I just thought trains were a great thing, and my children, I took them to Derry and took them on a train to Portrush or Coleraine or wherever, just so as they would know what a train was all about. And I have to say, I got my 2 sons reared, and they have good jobs each, and never got involved in anything. But I maintain that was because my father was, he could have sat down and discussed many things with them, and A lot of it would have been because of what war had taught him, and about his father dying when he was only 7 years of age. And I often thought afterwards, you know, that's a big thing to be telling a child at 7, your father never be coming home again. That's it. And I think my granny must have been a very strong woman too, when she could think of a child when things weren't going that well for herself, you know. And I think that's what made my father into the man he was, that you help people whether you have anything or not. You do your best for anybody that comes your direction. So all of that has brought us up to where we are today, and I'm still in campsite, and I won't be leaving it now unless I'm going out in a box. And if you have time sometime, come and see the park.
Well, is there anything else you want to talk about at that time? Because otherwise I'm going to turn this off.
No.
Is that okay?
I'm happy enough. I just wanted you to know the story of it.
No, that's absolutely fantastic, and brilliant story about your grandparents and your father and Anthony and everything else. It's exactly what we